Our next panel is Neighborhood Power, Organizing in the Aftermath of Civil Rights. And I will introduce our moderator, who will then take it from there. We're very lucky to have Tanvi Misra, who is a staff writer at CityLab, the Atlantic's website about cities. She covers immigration, housing, economic inequality, and criminal justice from a local lens. Her writing includes exclusive reportage, deep investigative dives, narrative features, and policy analyses, as well as essays and cultural critique. She curates CityLab's biweekly culture newsletter, Navigator, which elevates diverse perspectives on places, real and imagined. Misra obtained a BA degree in political science at the University of Pennsylvania and was trained as a multimedia journalist at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. And through her work, she seeks to foster nuanced conversations about equity, identity, and belonging. Tanvi.
It's always weird to hear your bio being read out loud. Thank you so much, Samir, for organizing this event and for this amazing exhibit. And thank you to all the speakers who came before us, because I feel like I've just already learned so much. I'm really excited about this panel because one thing that I cover cities. It's an interesting beat. I was just telling Rosemary before. It's a really interesting beat that I have, which is to cover local issues, but from a global lens. So I end up covering cities around the world and see very similar patterns emerge everywhere. But another thing that I see is an incredible amount of work at the community level, the resilience and the organizing, and just the incredible strength of people, at a grassroots level, trying to elevate their voices. So that's, I think our mandate in this panel would be to explore some of that, tactics, models, anecdotes of resistance and resilience. And with that, I want to go ahead and introduce the amazing panelists here. Please bear with me. I'm going to read through some of their bios, but I urge you to go through the bios in depth on your own time as well, because they have an amazing depth of work that they've done. So right next to me here is Amanda Huron, who's an associate professor of interdisciplinary social sciences at the University of the District of Columbia. Her research interests are in urban geography, the urban commons, affordable housing, tenant organizing, and the history of Washington, D.C. Her first book, Carving Out the Commons, Tenant Organizing and Housing Cooperatives in Washington, D.C., examines the successes and challenges of limited equity housing cooperatives in the city. She also serves on the board of directors of Empower DC, a citywide community organizing group. She's a native of Washington's Ward 1, so my neighbor. Next to her is Diane Wong. Diane is an assistant professor and faculty fellow in the Gallatin School of Individualized Study at NYU. She holds a PhD in American politics and an MA in comparative race, ethnicity, and immigration from Cornell University. Her current research focuses on intergenerational resistance to gentrification in New York, San Francisco, and Boston Chinatowns. Wong is currently based in New York City, where she works in close collaboration with community groups, with various community groups. So she'll have a great perspective from that work. And then at the end over there is Rosemary Ndubuizu, an associate professor of, I guess everyone knows her. I don't even need this, but I will go ahead and read through this. Associate professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University. She's a scholar who studies how housing policies are shaped by race, gender, political economy, and ideology. Her research, her manuscript in progress, historically and ethnographically traces how low-income Black women have been affected by post-1970s changes in public and affordable housing policies and advocacy. She's also had 10 years of involvement with One DC. So with that, Rosemary, why don't you start off and tell us a little bit more about your research and your work?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to specific thanks to the Anacostia Community Museum for inviting me and then hosting this amazing discussion. So I want us to all close our eyes for a second and all go ahead, have that deep breath. and we are imagining that we have won the right to the city. So that means we have won the right to DC. DC is the commons for all of us, for particularly the working class, to be able to control and govern what happens to the land in DC, right? And so once we won this right, and we've instituted or reinstituted actual democracy, participatory democracy, one of the things that we would immediately vote on, and I'm certain we will pass, would be making sure that we rebuild all public housing and ensure that housing is not for profit, but for human need. And after we build all of this family-friendly, differently abled family housing, one of the next things we will build is a public park. And this public park would be a family-friendly park that would honor the Black women in DC who started and sustained this right to the city movement that we just won and imagined. In this park, I imagine we would have a remembrance pond that would be specifically dedicated to the welfare rights activists in DC who became tenant activists. So these mothers like Hallie Patterson, who lived in Berry Farm, who sparked the first DC tenant union in the 1960s. So now that we have brought in the energy of winning and the radical dreaming of winning this right to the city, I want to shift us to a conversation about some of the historical waves of organizing in the city. So in my research, as was just previously mentioned, I study how Black women played an important role in tenant activism in the city, but also how their activism changed once the local government, but also the federal government, took a post-1970s austerity turn. And I study how these racist and gendered myths help facilitate the displacement of low-income Black mothers and their families. So I'm going to focus on these three distinct, although I'm saying they're interrelated, tenant organizing waves that kind of emphasize different organizing strategies. So from the late 1960s to about almost a decade, so the late 1970s, 1978, low-income Black mothers were engaged in what I'm calling the first wave of organizing, which is I'm calling a praxis of refusal. And this praxis of refusal was an organizing strategy that demanded a citywide end to capricious rent hikes, poor services, poor management, and a disrespect to DC's low-income families. Through organizing citywide tenant unions like the Citywide Tenant Union, these mothers articulated a praxis of refusal by launching some of the city's most historic rent strikes. With the Citywide Tenant Union specifically, which had much of its base in Berry Farm, and unfortunately many of the other public housings that are in the process or have been torn down, hundreds of public housing residents led a years-long rent strike to demand better housing and management. And this praxis of refusal, while it started with public housing residents, it actually spread citywide. So you have even renters in the private housing market demanding and leading rent strikes by hundreds and thousands. So you have also the Citywide Housing Coalition organizing at this time, creating close to 100, I think in 1978 they created almost 90 tenant associations. And there were already about 250 in the city, but they'd organized almost half of them. And they were constantly promoting rent strikes as the primary organizing tool to push back and to actually develop political power. Okay. So working class residents in the city, through rent strikes, were articulating a very clear analysis about renter resistance and renter solidarity. What I think is also important to remember is that they were able to reach the citywide level, and that they hoped that this renter resistance would be a catalyst to winning a broader struggle to remaking housing from a profit-driven model to a people-centered model. And they had that very clear understanding. And during this era, they were successful because they were thinking explicitly in political terms about building a power block. They were able to secure rent regulation, tenant protections, and even a brief moratorium that didn't seem to last very long on condo conversions. But Professor Huron will talk more specifically about some of these things. Then there was the next wave that kind of came after, and in many ways was facilitated. We could talk later about some of the contradictions of having a majority black governance that can sometimes sap the political strength of organizing efforts. In the second wave of organizing, I'm considering it more about tenant autonomy. And so by the early 80s, you have the rise of the Reagan administration, clearly saying that they're giving very little money to urban spaces and definitely not black urban communities. And so you have black tenant activists like Lozie York and Yolanda Ward, who was tragically murdered, who are demanding that DC dedicate more of its local resources to the development of affordable housing. And so, as Amanda Huron will point out more in her work as well, this city was constantly thinking about, and tenants were constantly thinking about how to organize to create and preserve resources that they can then sustain. So you have organizations like WISH, the Washington Inner City SelfHelp, you have Muscle, you have organizations, black women who are participating in these organizations literally were exercising their political power and putting the fire to primarily black politicians and demanding that they invest resources into resident management, into affordable home ownership, into co-ops, daycare centers, as a way to make sure DC was for black folks and sustain the working class. And so while these two different organizing waves place different strategic focus on autonomy versus resistance and fighting back, they were both very clear that tenants can play an important role as a voting bloc. And that's an important thing to remember, because as this organizing effort was ongoing, you have people like the former WISH director, Lehman Elmer, once argued that DC, people used to say you couldn't organize in DC because DC didn't have an industrial base. We weren't like Detroit. We didn't have a major labor movement that was driving the work. But he said, actually, it's a black city with a huge tenant base, and that's who you organized into a political bloc. And so he talked about how you get much more done if you can rethink what a tenant's political power is beyond their specific building. Then the last era, which gives way to our current era of resistance, greatly expanded after DC went into receivership. And so I'm sure we'll talk about the contradictions of DC being a colonial city. And so after receivership, DC went on steroids, and essentially to get out of receivership, DC's appointed government essentially gave away much of the land and definitely recruited many private developers to essentially build at will. But during this period, you have a mosaic of nonprofits and local groups creating what I would call like a mosaic of building resistance. And so that's the era we're in now. It's oftentimes building specific, where you're trying to fight to defend the affordability of your building. So we're trying to fight to maintain the limited gains we got over the last 40 years. And so with that, I want us to, as we talk hopefully later on today, we can think more about how we can pull from the lessons of the past in terms of their strategic analysis about what opportunities the tenants have to exercise political strength, and how we may need to rethink how we go about organizing now in a more of a defense model to an offense model.
Yeah, thank you.
Amanda, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Samir, and everyone for this incredible event. I'm really, really happy to be here and to be on this panel with you all. And my work has focused mostly on, similar to Rosemary's, looking at anti-displacement struggles and tenant organizing in DC. And I've specifically looked at the history of limited equity housing co-ops in the city, so efforts that tenants have made to purchase their buildings collectively and turn them into limited equity co-ops, of which we have many in this city. And I just wrote a book on this, which came out this year, about kind of the struggles and successes of those housing co-ops. So I think in terms of thinking about kind of some just key points that I would want to make that come out of that research, one is that, and Rosemary has talked about this, about the rent strikes and sort of rich history of rent strikes in the city, which I think is really important to remember, especially now as we see rent strikes returning now in the city as a successful tactic. And I was part of a conversation a couple weeks ago with folks from Picture the Homeless, who are in New York City, and City Life Vida Urbana, who are in Boston, really great organizing groups in those cities. And one of the things that was mentioned was how some scholars and activists are beginning to talk about aspects of the civil rights movement that could be considered a housing movement. And I appreciate thinking that way about, the pieces of the civil rights movement that really were thinking more about that as a housing movement, which I think is really interesting. And we certainly see this happening in DC. Members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee supported rent strikes all over DC. Those rent strikes that were taking place in the 60s. George Washington University had a black student union that was also supporting rent strikes around the city. So seeing that as part of the civil rights organizing that was going on, I think is really important. But I also think, when we start to look at the 70s, it's a period, and I think this is the second thing that I think is important to remember is for us today in DC, thinking about understanding the 70s as this time of intense gentrification in the city and just runaway gentrification, in a way that we think about it happening now, but remembering that that was really taking place then. By 1974, the city was experiencing about 100,000 evictions a year. 100,000 evictions a year. There were about 700,000 people in the city in 1974. So this is an intense amount of eviction. And the Washington Post regularly ran stories on, black people are being pushed out of Washington, D.C. People are being pushed into Prince George's County. I mean, it's similar to what we see today. And so the 70s, there was just this, it was really a crisis in terms of eviction and displacement in the city. And I'm particularly interested in this period because this is also, we see a lot of tenant organizing happening in the 70s too, and a lot of wins. And that's to what Rosemary was saying. I mean, we really see a lot of laws passed that are very progressive that help tenants. And so for me, it's interesting to see that, the 70s were a particularly rich time for anti-displacement organizing. And I think it's because two things kind of happened at the same time in the 70s. One was this intense gentrification that we saw going on. And the other was the onset of limited home rule in the city. And so if you know about the city's political history, you know that we did not have voting rights in the city, the ability to elect our own mayor and city council for 100 years. So it was in 1874 that we lost the right to vote for mayor and city council in the city, and we got that right back in 1974. So it's sort of a perfect 100-year arc of a loss of voting rights. And what's interesting about this history, it's very racialized. And when we look at why we lost the right to vote in 1874, it was because in 1867, just a few years earlier, black men had been given the right to vote in DC. And this was during Reconstruction, of course. Kate Mazur is a historian who wrote a great book about, it's called An Example for All the Land. It's about Reconstruction in DC and the effort to win equality and civil rights in the city during Reconstruction. So black men were given the right to vote in 1867, very much against Congress. The radical Republicans in Congress pushed this through. The white residents of the city were absolutely opposed to it. This was a case of congressional interference in the city's affairs. As they saw it, it was. But it was further to advance the cause of justice. And so black men got the right to vote, and they voted in very large numbers, in larger numbers disproportionate to their population in the city. I mean, they voted at higher rates than white men, and they were making their political power known. And then in 1874, the white business leaders of the city said, you know what, we can't let this go on. And so we would rather give up the right to vote for everyone in the city and lose those voting rights than risk the continuing political power of black people in the city. There's more to it than that. I mean, it's an interesting, compelling story, but that was one of the real roots of that decision, was this fear of black political power. So in 1974, we get home rule again because really of some very creative civil rights organizing that's done to get home rule back. And so we have our first home rule election in 1974 and elect candidates who, many of whom are coming out of the civil rights movement, most of whom are coming out of the civil rights movement, and are determined to try to create a more just city. And I think this kind of it goes back to what Kimberly Johnson was saying this morning, talking about chocolate cities this time as emancipatory spaces. And I think that was part of the feeling in DC in the mid-70s. But just as Black people are getting political power in the city, again, there is this threat of displacement from neighborhoods and from the city itself. And so one of the, really, some of the earliest things that the city council, that early city council in 1975 turned their attention to was housing rights and questions of displacement. Because of course you want to, there's this desire to be able to keep people in the city. And so there's a real political will to address displacement at this time, I think, that we don't see today. We have lots of good organizing today and there's victories today, but we don't see political will, I don't think, at the same level as we did in the 70s. But again, that political will came because tenants were organizing to kind of put it on the front burner. So that's a really interesting thing, I think, that's going on in the 70s in the city. And then there's a bunch of creative legislation that Rosemary talked about, alluded to. There's rent control that we get in 1975. There's a couple, I think, of different moments where there's moratorium on condominium conversions in the city, where the city just said, we have to stop converting rentals to condos. It's too crazy. We have to figure out what's going on here. And one of the most important and interesting and creative wins, I think, that came out of that was the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which was a law. This is the law that gives tenants the right to purchase their buildings if their landlords choose to put them up for sale. It's a highly unusual law. Most cities don't have this. Cities where there's really strong, great tenant organizing don't have this. San Francisco, for instance, does not have this law. I've talked to people in San Francisco who are like, we want that law. How can we get that law? I've talked to people in Portland who are like, we want that law. People in Boston, we want that law. So we do have this, and we've had it on the books since 1975. And one of the earliest uses of this law was in 1976. A group of 26 families were evicted en masse from one block in Adams Morgan. And they turned to the Adams Morgan organization, which was this community group working in Adams Morgan, for assistance to exercise those rights to purchase, to actually enable them to buy. Some of those tenants were able to buy their buildings and stay on that block. And so since that time, many tenant associations have used this right to purchase their buildings when their landlords put them up for sale and turn them into low equity or limited equity cooperatives that are affordable, stable housing, affordable, stable home ownership for the long term. And of course, they can only exercise that right if the funds are available from the city to help them purchase the buildings. That's an important, very important point. But the other point that's important is, again, to connect to what Rosemary was discussing, most of these co-op efforts have been led by Black and Latino women, both in terms of actually organizing the building in the first place, making the co-op purchase, but then that long-term organizing that's required to keep the co-op going in the face of tremendous pressure in these gentrifying neighborhoods. And so it's really that this work has been done by Black and brown women, usually very low income. This is true globally. I was listening to a research presentation recently. People who defend their housing often are women. And it's not seen as work, it's not, the work that they're doing is not seen as work, as labor, and it really is. It's not waged work, it's not typically physical or manual labor, but it's the work of organizing meetings, making phone calls, knocking on doors, making decisions, guiding sort of collective decision-making processes, and it's work that really goes unrecognized, which I think is important to remember. And then just the last point I want to make is that tenants are continuing to use the rights that we won in the 70s to organize today. Just one story. Just on October 1st, a few weeks ago, tenants started a rent strike at 1320 Nicholson Street Northwest because of the terrible conditions of the building. They put their rental payments into an escrow account instead of giving them to the landlord. The landlord, this is October 27th, has already caved, wants to sell the building, so that triggers the tenant's TOPA rights. And they might choose to buy the building themselves, or they might choose to work with a third-party developer to come in to buy the building and keep it affordable for them. But either way, they have this negotiating power because they have this law on their side and they're exercising it. They'll have a lot more options, a lot more power, and a lot more ability to claim their right to the city. So that, I think, is very exciting to think about. Thanks.
ahead.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing space with me, and a special thank you to Samir for organizing all of this and the staff for making it happen. I'm really grateful to be in dialogue with such an incredible group of thinkers. Can everyone hear me in the room? Okay. I appreciate that there is this kind of space for us to reflect about the work that has been done and all that continues to be done in our communities. To be fully transparent about my own positionality and where I stand in relation to this work, I speak as a researcher who has written on many of the themes discussed today, and also as a community organizer who is deeply involved with anti-displacement work in Manhattan's Chinatown specifically. When I think of the work that many urban political scientists have done, questions of power resonate, but it is often discussed as a top-down process and in relation to the state rather than what happens on the ground in our communities. Power is often understood as something that is elusive or cultivated through formal political spheres rather than as something that happens in intimate spaces. Power is often described as a force that imposes limitations rather than as something that moves us to imagine political possibilities outside of current realities. In an effort to think more expansively about power, and in particular neighborhood power, I want to uplift these questions for conversation. What are the places in neighborhoods that build power? And what does it look like to build in a way that is patient, inclusive, imaginative, and intentional? How do we recenter those who have been on the periphery of so much of our academic writing? How do indigenous communities, immigrants, peoples of color, trans and non-binary people, and those who live in precarious conditions manage to disrupt dominant structures and participate in a kind of politics that relate to their daily lives? So a while back, I sat on a panel and a podcast with urban politics scholars Peter Burns and Clarence Stone to talk about the role of elites in urban politics. I push for a need for scholars to ask questions beyond regimes and elites when it comes to understanding the critical questions confronting our cities. There is a disjuncture when it comes to what urban politics scholars are choosing to write about versus what is actually happening on the ground in communities. From housing justice work in New York City to labor rights in Los Angeles to education in Chicago, we know that change often doesn't come from the top down, but that it starts with growing the grassroots. It begins with ordinary people who are capable of mobilizing resources, building across generations, shaping political outcomes, and developing the leadership capacities of others in their same apartment buildings or down the block. Drawing from a combination of ethnography, participant mapping, archival research, and oral histories, my research documents how tenants, organizers, restaurant and garment workers, small business owners, public health workers, elders, and the younger generation in New York, Boston, and San Francisco Chinatowns are building neighborhood power outside of formal political channels around the issue of gentrification. The rate in which working class residents, immigrants, and communities of color are being displaced from their homes is happening on a scale not seen since the federally sponsored urban renewal programs in the 1960s. The percentage of Asian immigrants residing in Chinatowns across the country has declined drastically in the last 10 years. In New York's Chinatown, many of these changes have accelerated after 9/11 due to specific housing and land use policies and practices. In the years after 9/11, Mayor Bloomberg targeted Lower Manhattan, including the Lower East Side and Chinatown, for redevelopment, not only to rebuild, but to encourage market rate and luxury developments. Although the housing stock in New York's Chinatown consists primarily of low-rise tenement walk-up buildings, there are now more than 24 as-of-right hotel developments and an 84-story skyscraper being constructed at this moment, which has paved the way for other towers that would add an additional 2,000 market-rate apartment units, changing the face of the neighborhood forever. Across the country, city governments are partnering with developers, financial institutions, and art nonprofits to push for unaffordable development projects at the expense of longtime residents and their livelihoods. These partnerships have relied on tactics like tax subsidies, eminent domain, upzoning, and the systematic deregulation of rent-regulated and rent-controlled housing. Even though much has been written about gentrification, we still know surprisingly little about those who are most impacted by the process on a daily basis. While the conventional narrative is often that people are being pushed out of their homes without a fight, that is not true, as residents in New York's Chinatown and other neighborhoods are mobilizing hard at the grassroots level to confront dispossession in all its forms. From organizing intergenerational dialogues about displacement in the oldest continually run store in New York's Chinatown, to tenants taking their predatory landlords to court for unfair evictions, to women-led artist collectives using their cultural work as resistance to erasure, my research and organizing work centers what those most impacted have been doing to stay in their homes. In important ways, the issue of gentrification makes visible the everyday politics of urban immigrant communities because so much of the issues of daily life in the community are at stake. My work provides a nuanced understanding of the conditions under which Chinese immigrants and youth are active in the making of urban space and urban politics, shifting away from the common narrative that portrays them as disengaged from democratic processes. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to provide a glimpse into what residents are doing specifically in New York's Chinatown to build power and to make critical connections between the issues of gentrification, detention, and incarceration. Founded in 1986, CAB, Organizing Asian Communities, is a pan-Asian organization that works to build the grassroots power of low-income Asian immigrants and refugees across New York City. Their Chinatown Tenants Union, or CTU, develops the leadership capacities of low-income tenants to organize against predatory landlords and evictions. A critical component of CTU's anti-displacement work centers the political education and the leadership development of individual tenants so that they have the resources to form tenant associations and to take predatory landlords to court. In Chinatown, many predatory landlords have intentionally bought out buildings with large percentage of Chinese tenants who live in rent-regulated units and have taken advantage of the fact that many of them are undocumented, limited English speaking, or poor to clear out the units. They have used various tactics to force tenants out of their homes, from refusing to provide heat, hot water, and basic repairs to using hazardous construction practices as a tactic. Through building alliances, door-to-door outreach, direct action campaigns, and language justice workshops, CAB CTU supports the formation of bilingual tenant associations in buildings across Chinatown owned by predatory landlords like James Wong and R.A. Cohen. These tenant associations play a critical role in building individual and collective tenant power in such a way that centers the immediacy of language justice. Another group that does critical anti-displacement work is an artist collective called the Chinatown Art Brigade, or CAB. CAB is a women-led collective of Asian artists, media makers, residents, and activists driven by deep love for Chinatown and the belief that fighting against racial and economic inequality is central to the cultural art and media-making process. One ongoing project is CAB's Here to Stay, which is a series of large-scale outdoor mobile projections that uplift the themes of gentrification, displacement, and neighborhood resilience. The outdoor projections are co-created with CAB CTU tenant membership through oral histories, storytelling, placekeeping walks, power mapping, and drawing sessions. The messages, images, and videos that the Chinatown tenants create are then featured in a series of outdoor mobile projections in order to uplift tenant narratives and the experiences of those most impacted by displacement. Some of the projections have highlighted the need for the Chinatown Working Group rezoning plan, which is a community-led rezoning plan with the intent to provide and preserve affordable housing stock and small businesses in the neighborhood. Recently, in March of this year, CAB collaborated with Asian Americans United's Chinatown Youth Organizing Project in Viet Lead in Philadelphia's Chinatown to work on a series of projections that connects the issues of gentrification with immigrant detention and deportation. 2 months ago, Mayor de Blasio released a plan to build 4 new prison complexes under the guise of closing Rikers Island. The new prison complexes are proposed to be built in downtown Brooklyn, South Bronx, Kew Garden, Queens, and Manhattan's Chinatown. These neighborhoods are already over-policed and undergoing gentrification. Gentrification and incarceration are tightly connected. The developers and contractors who are bidding on the new prison complexes are the same ones that have been building out-of-scale luxury developments in places like Brooklyn, Harlem, and Chinatown. The proposed sites for the detention complex in Manhattan's Chinatown is at 80 Center Street, which is steps away from the Manhattan Housing Court, a place that tenants interact with frequently because of increased evictions and landlord harassment due to gentrification. This isn't the first time that the city has proposed to expand the carceral regime in Manhattan's Chinatown. The new complex will be built next to the Tombs, which is also known as the Manhattan Detention Complex, that currently houses over 1,000 prisoners, most of them pre-trial detainees. Given the short timeline of this plan, CAB, along with others, are working across generations to develop a language around the issue that is not driven by anti-Blackness or NIMBYism, but inspires real alternatives to displacement, incarceration, and other forms of dispossession. It is not simply enough to keep people in their homes and their neighborhoods. Building neighborhood power means developing meaningful relationships, creating alternative community spaces for engagement, building across generations, and sharing knowledge in a way that's accessible for all. The work that residents in New York Chinatown are doing to build neighborhood power is very much in line with revolutionary thinker Grace Lee Boggs calls visionary organizing, which is rooted in the understanding that another world is not only possible, but that ordinary people are already building that vision. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah, could we have a round of applause for all of their remarks and work? Thank you. So I'm going to sort of, ask a couple of questions to get this conversation going, but I will be hawkishly monitoring the time because I want to leave plenty of time for the audience to ask our panelists some questions because there's so many of us and I feel like we've all had lived experiences and work that really complements or is relevant to what our panelists here have worked on. So just to start, Rosemary, you mentioned something about starting on a grim note, but this idea of defending gains that we've made over the last few decades. We know from our previous speakers and just having read history that a lot of that there's structural reasons and intentional policy at every level of government because of which that has happened. But could you perhaps draw out some lessons within the organizing landscape that we can draw from the fact that we're still sort of in that position?
Well, I also should give, to answer that, it's a great question. So I used to be a full-time organizer with 1DC. I still am connected to 1DC and enjoy doing unpaid organizing when I can. So the reason why I say that and share that is because in my experience over the last 10 years, or 12 years, I guess, of doing organizing, one of the things I think has happened is while we have this mosaic of building specific resistance, it's become much harder for us to develop an analysis, a shared analysis about the global domination in terms of capital in DC, right? And so most of our tactical efforts are oftentimes focusing on landlords or the state, the local state, not even the federal state. So when you have this, in some ways, I guess a critical way of saying it would be a fragmented approach of dealing with the building defenses. Not to say building defenses that is absolutely crucial. That's the frontline work that must be done. However, one of the things I think is a historic lesson is that it was clear these organizers in the 70s and a little bit of the 80s were more intentional about thinking about how to build tenant power as political power. And in order to do that in the current moment, that means we would have to develop an analysis of the city acting as a global actor, and how we are now going to think about capital just as much as we would think about the state, and thinking about the state in the local level, but the federal level. We are literally in the backyard of the federal government. And I can't recall the last time, and maybe Dominic Molden can talk about the coordinated efforts we've done in scale to attack and address the federal government and all of the different private interests that have been forcing capital's return, right, to the city. And so that's what I think is more needed, is for us to rethink how we can build tenant power in a moment of global capital, as well as thinking about how we can increase scale to deal with the different levels of government.
Diane, I'm hoping that you can sort of weigh in, given that New York, I feel like, is one of those cities that really exemplifies that, right? Like all of this global capital pooling in and creating these very, very localized changes and effects. So could you talk about some lessons you've learned through your organizing or the history of organizing in New York City, in New York's Chinatown?
Yeah, so, I think specifically in Manhattan's Chinatown, you see a lot of the global capital moving in, definitely under Bloomberg, where a lot of foreign capital investments were encouraged, and which is why you see in Manhattan Chinatown, many of the landlords are actually co-ethnic, right? They're Chinese landlords. And so this brings into the question, how do we organize around co-ethnic exploitation, right? This is something that a lot of organizers in Manhattan Chinatown specifically organized around in the labor movement in Manhattan Chinatown to fight for unions, right? And so now there are a lot of unions that exist in Manhattan Chinatown, like at Jingfeng and at Golden Dragon, these dim sum places that which were fought by over decades. And so the same question exists now. What are tenants, what are these tenant organizers and organizations like CAB what are they going to do to really think about the complexities of co-ethnic exploitation, what that resistance looks like in practice? There hasn't really been a nuanced understanding or conversation around that. But the tenant organizing that we're seeing in Manhattan's Chinatown stems back to a long and rich history of resistance in Chinatowns across the country. Right? I think there's often the perception that spaces, Asian immigrant urban spaces, are not necessarily connected to larger liberation movements, freedom movements, but that's really not the case. And specifically in New York's Chinatown, there's a lot of conversation on the We Won't Move movement in San Francisco's Manila town, right? I think the I Hotel and the struggles around I Hotel really exemplify sort of conversations around urban renewal, displacement, et cetera. But a similar movement happened around the same time in New York's Chinatown in the early 1970s when Bell Telephone Company tried to basically buy up an entire block of property and displace all of the low income. There were a lot of Latinx and Chinese immigrants who were living in that area. And they displaced over 296 families in order to create a new plant, right? So as a result of years of resistance, that block still exists today. And so a lot of the organizers who were involved in that struggle are now presently involved in the anti-displacement struggle in Manhattan's Chinatown, either as volunteers, as phone bankers, or door knockers, et cetera.
Amanda, would you like to add anything, or just extrapolate from your own experience?
I just feel like there's so much good stuff that's been said. I mean, I do think, well, I guess one thing that I'd add, just as another kind of story, sort of example of things that happened in the DC experience. And Rosemary had mentioned Washington Inner City SelfHelp, which was an organization that was founded in 1978, sort of 10 years after our own rebellion here in 1968. And the idea was 40 churches got together to kind of co-found this organization. That would be a citywide organization that would work on helping low-income people advocate for themselves instead of just providing services to them. So hence the self-help idea there. So Washington Inner City SelfHelp, or WISH, and they did a ton of organizing around a lot of different things. They organized around immigrant rights, early on. They organized around police brutality. They organized around services for the elderly, and ultimately, really, anti-displacement organizing became one of the main things they focused on. And one of the really interesting, there's tons of interesting work that they did. And if you go to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library, there is an archives of the WISH papers. Some of the WISH staff were incredibly good at keeping records, and so there's a beautiful, huge archives of papers about WISH's history, so you can please go check it out. But so WISH, they really saw the housing co-op as doing two things, and they were one of the organizations that helped start these housing co-ops. They believed that the housing co-op would both address the desperate need for housing affordability and stability in the city, but also would help train people in neighborhood-scale democracy in the city, because a co-op it's a democratic institution. That's the idea of a co-op. And so they were really interested in this co-op, not just for the housing it was providing, but also for the sort of building of a small-scale democracy in the city. And then one of the things, and so they're really focused on DC, of course, but they also did this really incredible work in South Africa in the early 90s, just as apartheid was ending. So like Mandela had been released from prison, but he wasn't yet elected president. It was like this really crazy time in South Africa. And during that moment, there were tenants in Johannesburg who lived in 7 different buildings who wanted to turn their buildings into housing co-ops, which had never been done in South Africa before. And they found out about WISH because WISH had some international connections. And ultimately, WISH went to South Africa. WISH members and WISH staff and co-op members WISH worked with made several visits to South Africa in the early 90s to meet with tenants and to talk to them about how they did this work in DC and how those tenants could do it in South Africa. They saw it as sort of an extension of their mission. We're talking about sort of Black claims to the city and how we can stay in these cities and take control of our housing. And I thought that was a really amazing project that they were enacting there in the early 90s. So I think that's just to say that, this is very local work, but it is also, globally connected, or can be potentially. And so I think that's, you all have both been making that point as well, the desire to really stake a claim to particular places in particular cities, but also the ways we can connect with other people doing that work around the world, I think is really exciting. And that's already happened in the city in many places, but just to know that history is important, I think, moving forward.
One sort of something that's come up in my own reporting regarding that was news to me, but was incredibly, was just interesting, was I was in Paris and reporting on, what people often like to call it the other Paris. And, it's actually the othered Paris. It's just this, these places in the suburbs that have all this public housing. And one of the really interesting things I found in my reporting was the amazing amount of organizing that's happening, especially around issues of police brutality. And funnily enough, that infrastructure did not exist before, but came about as a result of an Obama-era initiative where these young people from outside all of these French cities went to Chicago to learn how to, just the basics of community organizing, and have applied the same sort of techniques there. And now, when something happens, they immediately have the resources and infrastructure to, already in place. So that's kind of an also interesting, transatlantic parallel. I wanted to have us talk a little bit about, because I think that this is sort of tying in a couple of threads that have been mentioned before, this idea of converting tenant power to political power. Could you talk about the role of coalition building? And I believe it was Howard who mentioned this before, or someone else from that panel. How do you connect with other organizers across who are working on issues, community issues, either on different fronts, not housing, for example, transit equity, other economic development, but also who are sort of voicing the interests of different communities, right? What have you seen in your work that sort of gives us some sense of how that's working? Anyone is free to jump in. Dan, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. So about coalitions, right?
Yeah, just sort of, building solidarity across different types of movements and peoples.
Yeah. I think specifically in Manhattan's Chinatown, before even thinking about relationship building beyond the neighborhood and coalition building, there needs to be an understanding of language justice, right? What are ways that we can connect issues like gentrification? How do we communicate that in a way that elderly tenants can understand? Because the term gentrification doesn't really translate into Mandarin or Cantonese in a way that's effective, because the ways in which tenants on the ground experience things like what we call gentrification in many ways manifests with evictions, with landlord harassment, with an eviction notice, right? Those are tangible things in the ways in which they experience gentrification. So I think rethinking the kind of language we're using around gentrification that resonates with the experiences of those most impacted is really critical before even thinking about building coalitions and relationships beyond the neighborhood. But in the work that CAB does, a lot of it is about alliance building, and specifically understanding that gentrification that's happening in Chinatown doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? The art galleries that we're seeing in Manhattan's Chinatown, there are over now 140 art galleries in the Lower East Side and Chinatown. Many of the owners of the same galleries are the same ones who own galleries in places like Harlem, in Bushwick, right? So there are connections there that need to be made. The developers, contractors are also the same actors. So coalition building and that kind of work is critical. So CAV is part of the Right to the City Coalition that includes several grassroots orgs across the 4 boroughs. In addition, the Stabilizing New York City Coalition, which includes 16 different grassroots orgs across the boroughs. I'm not necessarily sure if Staten Island is part of the coalition, actually. But that's another story. But then, so it's interesting because Stabilizing New York City incorporates legal structures, advocacy work, in addition to grassroots building. And every year they have a campaign to fight for rent freezes and also a rent rollback. And 2 years ago, 2 years ago in 2016, and I believe also in 2015, that was the first time in which New York City saw a rent freeze. And so that was historic, and that was a moment in which a lot of the tenants the CTU tenants at CAF felt like their work sort of had an effect on the ground.
What does that look like in DC?
I think DC has different types of coalitions. So, of course, there's coalitions on the ground with many nonprofits to every year pressure the Housing Production Trust Fund to increase funding. We can talk about that and the limits of that vision, but at the same time, a commitment to ensuring that the city continues to invest local resources, especially as the federal government completely abdicated that responsibility 30 years ago. But there's also coalitions, I think, as Diane mentioned, that are like Right to the City alliances, where different nonprofits and community organizations in the city are trying to connect on a national level. So, for instance, One DC, and I think Bread for the City may have sent some folks as well to Right to the City, some of the national convenings, to develop a shared analysis and to continue to practice renter solidarity at a national level. And I think that work is ongoing and extremely important, especially given the need for us to constantly figure out how can we experiment with new ways of political resistance in this moment. Because at the end of the day, I do think that we need to spend more time, just as we would have constant, coalitions around building resistance. We need to do the same to figure out how to create the offensive strategy and the long-term strategy. We need to think 20, 30 years ahead of how we want to reclaim the city and defeat many of these structural injustices. And so that requires a strategic reflection and strategic alliance around those questions. And so I think the Right to the City is one of those configurations. And then, of course, the movement for Black Lives Visions, I think it is. Visions of Black Lives is now also another configuration that I think One DC is a part of. To try to help think through how we can make sure that any movement work we do is around this question of Black liberation.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Rosemary had mentioned the Citywide Housing Coalition, which was this organization in the 70s, founded in 1974, explicitly to, quote, build a militant housing movement in this city. I mean, that's just what they wanted. And they did a lot of really interesting, I think, coalition work with other organizations around the city. It's and it appears, and I don't know very much about this particular what I'm about to say, but I think there's a fair amount of crossover with leadership in the DC Rape Crisis Center.
Yeah, there
right.
were.
So
Yolanda
there's
Ward.
right, exactly. So Yolanda Ward, who Rosemary mentioned, was both the one of the leaders, one of the heads of the Citywide Housing Coalition at one point, and was also a leader in the DC Rape Crisis Center, which had become a Black women-led organization in the mid-'70s. So thinking about the relationship, they were clearly thinking about the coalition building, thinking about the importance of housing stability and safety, and also safety from sexual violence. So the ways that those intersected, I think, seems like it was some very interesting coalition building. And the one other thing I'll say about the Citywide Housing Coalition that I think is interesting is, part of what they were trying to do also was keep a working class base in DC so that when progressive groups from around the country came to this city to try to press for change at the federal level, they had some base of local support here, which I think is a really interesting way to think about it. We have this role that we play as a place where people come from all over to lobby, to try to get the federal government to change those policies. And so this group was thinking, okay, how can we, we need to keep working class people in the city in order to provide that base of support, which I think is fascinating and important.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask a question, but I want to throw it to the audience. Actually, there's already an audience question, so why don't we just go straight to you? And everyone else, please get thinking so that we can keep it moving.
Yeah, so I find myself somewhat giddy here because there's a panel that's full of women, right? And I think often the labor of women, particularly in this subject, is invisible. And with that being said, I wanted to ask particularly Rosemary, but any other panelists who might answer this question. We heard some excellent sort of presentations earlier, wonderful keynote. I wonder what would you offer to those other presenters, as well as to the discourse on gentrification about women's labor, both in movements, both in the future, what we might anticipate in the future of the outcomes and organizing around these movements. But what would you offer? What's important for us to take away about women's labor? And also their experiences, because I think, particularly in my work in public housing, women are right at the center of this, at least in terms of being impacted. Thank you.
That's a great question, Kalfani. One of the things that I've learned over and over again, not only in the archival research, but in the actual political organizing work, is that Black women are constantly hyper-visible, but invisible at the same time. And so you will have, I didn't want to be too critical, but we're gonna say some things. So one of the things that I think is extremely telling is that over and over again, you will hear the racist and gendered myth that Black women don't know how to keep up their homes, right? Low-income Black women don't need to keep up their homes, so you have all these, reform efforts to teach women, Black women in public housing especially, how to keep up their homes. And it becomes the fodder for developers and even state officials to then justify displacing Black women. But then you also have, even as those are very clear racist gendered myths, you also still have similar logics circulating even in the ecosystem of resistance, right? Where low-income Black women need to just show up to an action, but they're not the ones who are oftentimes at the forefront demanding who should be at the table, right? In terms of strategizing. And so I think that there is this almost malevolent paternalism that happens within this ecosystem of resistance that we need to call out and stop perpetuating. Because I can talk about many experiences we've had at even 1DC, where when Black women are demanding new forms of coalition work, completely invisible, can't say anything. But get somebody else to bring in somebody non-Black, somebody non-woman, suddenly people are like, yeah, let's rethink these questions again. And you're like, what? Mm-hmm. So there's constant needs for us to unpack why we're so deeply invested in constantly reproducing the Black woman as the other, to then be saved, to then be coddled, or to then be pushed. And to develop also another analysis where it can allow us to root out the anti-Blackness, root out this idea of paternalism, but then also give a vision of tenant solidarity so that it's not always about just saving one building or saving one business, and thinking in terms of scale about how we all see ourselves a part of this new rights of the city. Because if we don't see ourselves in it, then you won't be trying to create a we. You'll be trying to create, let's save them, which is, again, paternalism. So that's kind of what I'm hoping Black women continually remind us, and that's what I think they do, is remind me and others that if you really want this fight if we really want to win the city, then we all need to think about how we're invested in this city.
Yeah.
Dan, Amanda, would you like to add anything?
I mean, I think it's a great question about sort of the work that women do, and how it's not seen as work and invisibilized. And I want to keep thinking about that, with you and with everyone. Yeah.
So I do not have the expertise of these women right here, but I think one thing that I want to add, just from having spoken to people who are doing this work, is and sort of connected back to things we're talking about, for example, gentrification, is this idea, again, of saving and how it's connected to, I just want to draw back and look at the history and how those ideas have always existed and now are sort of reproducing themselves in the context that, in a very local context. I mean, for example, what I heard and saw in when I was reporting in Paris was that idea of these women with their burqas and their an assumption that they need to be saved, they need to be taught how to do things the French way, and this idea that actually having all these people go in and live there will be the way that happens, and that that culture, the the political power, the civic sort of, civic, just the civic power also would not be coming from those sources themselves inherently. So I think I feel like even in sort of our gentrification narrative, that same dynamic as it pertains to women of color specifically, and specifically Black women, does reproduce itself in broader trends that we're seeing in our cities. Do we have more questions?
Yes, my name's David Schwartzman. I've lived in D.C. I'm not a native-born Washingtonian, but I've lived here for the last 42 years, so I thank the panel for kind of reminding me of the history, which I missed a lot of. But my question is really how race and class intersect right now in D.C. politics. And the context I want to give you is the huge economic and racial disparities we see, which are not really talked about much. I'll give you one example. Fiscal Policy Institute did a study, 2010 to 2017. The median income of white households actually increased to $134,000, while Black households stayed constant at $42,000. And the poverty rate returned to the pre-recession. It's about 17%. Of course, half the children, mainly Black in Ward 8, live in poverty. So my question is, I think everyone knows that we've had Black mayors since the control board. We do have just 6 council people that are Black, the 7 are white. But how does race and class intersect in terms of getting let's say, the goals that I think we all want?
I guess that's for one of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can tag team this one.
Right.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think the point about the income disparity is huge. Also, the wealth disparity that was mentioned, which is much, much, much huger, is really important. Absolutely. I think, another component of it, too, besides another component is education and access to quality public education. That is, depending on depending on your race and class, you have a huge disparity in terms of how you can access quality public education in the city. And I think that's a big part of our problem as well. Big problem, obviously, many places. And I think, it's interesting. I mean, in this moment, we have some progressive people on our city. Well, it depends how you classify progressive. We do have some progressive folks on the city council right now. And we have had in the past, I would say, at various points, really pretty progressive city councils in the past. I think now we have definitely moved much since Williams. We've moved more towards a very different model, as you know, of investment in the city. Williams' plan, when he was, so Williams had been the CFO of the city during the control board era when the Congress took over the city. At Mayor Berry's, Mayor Berry was not 100%. He knew he needed that. Actually, I mean, Berry, knew that the city was in terrible financial shape, and so that was the one option at that point as he saw it. So Congress basically takes over the city and eviscerates a lot of city services during the 90s, including my institution, the University of the District of Columbia, was eviscerated in the 1990s. Half of our staff were fired. We lost over half of our students. We're still recovering from that time. And so these public institutions were really hit hard through structural adjustment programs, essentially, is what the control board was doing in the city. And as part of the kind of rebuilding the city after that time, Williams had this plan to bring in 100,000 new residents, which everyone laughed at. And initially, my understanding, I'd actually liked, I don't know if anyone has the details on this, but my understanding, because I remember it happening when he made this proposal, but I would want to see the documentation, is that originally he said he wanted 100,000 new childless residents. Mm-hmm. What's that? We just said residents. Are you sure? Okay. But there was this idea that he wanted the residents who were going to provide revenue. I mean, that was the point. Earners, people who are out there earning money. Kids are okay. So I don't want to repeat that if that's just a rumor. So never mind. Don't want to put fiction out there. But the point is, he was really trying to bring in residents specifically who were higher earners. Because the point was, the reason you want new residents is to build the tax base. I mean, that goes back to the earlier discussion this morning. So, the point being that was the sort of the very important policy behind the gentrification that we started to see, really starting at the very end of the century, very early 2000s. That most recent wave of gentrification. Yeah. So that's an important part of the history of this, and how we get to now. With our current political moment.
We'll leave that for the next time.
There's a lot. Yeah, that's
they
right.
They can solve it.
I do want to add, it's a great point, Amanda, but I do want to add that there was a moment in D.C. where we thought black governance would mean that we would be able to balance we would resolve the contradictions of the city that were in terms of class. Right, that the black middle class could be a service provider, but at the same time be a space where the black middle class would remain. That completely went out the window once Reagan came into the office, right? So this fiction, and it's well, I won't say it's fiction, but this political hope that black capitalism, black governance would produce spaces where black people can then share and care for each other, quickly went out the window once they realized the federal support was not there. And I'm one of those people who I'm deeply, deeply critical of black politicians, but I also understand the structural constraints they had. They literally were under assault. Yes, Marion Barry has plenty of issues, and I will not be one of those cheerleaders for him. But I do understand that Marion Barry was under a particular type of surveillance and assault by the Reagan administration specifically. And it hurt much of his efforts in terms of trying to secure federal resources. And so I think that that's the other point that we also need to recognize as a structural constraints. But then also the reality is the black middle class, much of them, including the aspiring ones, fail to understand how class and poverty was not a psychological and personal problem. It was a structural one. Mm-hmm. And they bought the Kool-Aid. On whatever that is. I don't know, bought the drink or whatever. Who knows? On that.
Drink the Kool-Aid.
Thank you. I forgot that. And that's one of the frustrating things that we need to think about as we're trying to think about how to rebuild tenant solidarity in this moment where everyone thinks that they are not poor, right? And so how do we also challenge this legacy of race too, and how many of us within the black community have thought that if we just got out of the ghetto, then we would have been able to say we're now successful, and rethinking what does it look like for black collective work to happen where we're not constantly looking down on a certain segment of our community.
Mm-hmm. Before we go to the next question, if I may just prompt Diane to talk about sort of how that dynamic plays out, because I definitely see a parallel with a lot of immigrant communities with, sort of this idea of really buying into certain aspects of the American dream, which, wealth and whiteness, and how that manifests in sort of how you deal as an organizer with that dynamic and try to challenge it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a dominant narrative in many urban immigrant spaces like Chinatown that the notion of success is tied to you leaving, right? In order for you to be successful, you have to leave a place where your parents were essentially, in many ways, forced to live in for survival, right? And I think what we're seeing is that there are second, third, fourth generation Chinese Americans in Chinatowns and other communities that are resisting that narrative, right? So one of the organizations I work with in Manhattan's Chinatown is called the WOW Project, which is located in the oldest continually run store in New York's Chinatown. And it's run by a fifth generation store owner named Mei Lam. And so her family was about to sell the 5-story red brick building in 2006. But instead, she decided to take over the space because she realized that in selling that building, it would change what the entire block would look like down the line. Right, it's located on Mott Street, sort of what was historically known as the heart of Manhattan's Chinatown. And so in her decision to not leave, to really stay put, as what someone mentioned, Grace Lee Boggs, I think it was you, Professor Nancy, and just really stay put and plant deeper roots is what we're seeing in places like Manhattan's Chinatown. And so, yes, there's that narrative that, you know, to be successful, to make it in the American dream is to sort of leave your home, but that's not necessarily the case because there is that level of resistance that's happening on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Great. Are there other questions?
Yes. My name is Kimon Freeman, representing WEAC Radio, the only broadcast outlet east of the river. Really glad to be here to see this turnout, and it's a wonderful panel. I mean, all day has been wonderful. But I would push back and say that we don't necessarily have progressive members on the council since they have canceled DC voters and repealed an election. I think that no longer marks them as progressive. But having said that, I think DC has achieved statehood. It is a colonial state. We have the average white family has 81 times the wealth of the average black family here. And so when we have a housing market that's driven by profit margins, we are at a disadvantage all over again. So having said that, we're very sincere about creating a retention plan for long-time residents and small businesses. I would like to hear what are your thoughts on what we should be doing, because oftentimes we're very clear on what we're against, we're very studied on the problem, but we're not very sure on what we should be doing about that problem and what we should be fighting for. So beyond the community land trust, I'm glad that was mentioned here today, of which I'm a part of, what can we do to create a long-time retention plan for businesses and residents? I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on that. And anyone in the audience that have thoughts on that, please contact us because we're launching a program next Wednesday. We wanted to do it after this event. And it's called Gentrification and Displacement. It's be on our station every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Just please contact us with your action ideas, and we will follow up and listen to you as well. Thank you.
Who wants to take that first? Okay, go ahead.
Well, One DC has a people's platform that lays out about 10 of the principles that we think needs to happen. And we lay out community land trust. We lay out that we need to have massive reinvestment in public housing. We need to institute rent caps, again, to actually bring teeth back to rent control, because rent control has been essentially eaten away. We also need to ensure, I'm going to bring it back, living wage work. That's what we've been talking about, is how to, at the Black Workers Center at One DC, is how do we talk about how black work has always usually been historical code for bad work or no work, right? And so to institute a right to the city that centralizes work that you can choose to do, but also recognizing in the tradition of welfare rights activists, recognizing care work is work. So making sure that that is enumerated or compensated in a way so that care workers who live at home and care for their families are not sidelined in definitions of valued work.
Can I push back and sort of ask a follow-up really quick before I let the other panelists speak on that? Public housing, that is a much, what's the right word? Just something that's fallen out of favor amongst at least certain parts of the housing sort of universe. Could you talk about that sort of in the historical context and why you think that that is the way to go?
So it's a great point. A lot of that has to do, a lot of why public housing has fell out of disfavor is because it was inherently the way it was created, not the way it was politically advocated. Mm-hmm. It was implemented to be a racist form of Jim Crow housing, right? However, in the early stages, there were many efforts to make sure that the housing was decent and had truly affordable rents. And so essentially public housing as an idea, making sure that housing should be according should be at a very truly affordable and not constantly going up according to rate. It's a way of trying to remove housing from the profit-driven model that we have now. And public housing can be redesigned and many other, that's the other thing I can say. It doesn't have to necessarily be the mixed income housing, that's now a code word for gentrification in many ways. It can be redesigned in a way so that it's family friendly, because you could have a berry farm where the residents, when they were talking in the 1960s, I'll just say this briefly, when they were talking about how can we redesign Berry Farm because it was a wartime housing that was poorly constructed, they were clear that it was like, we want a front yard and a backyard, but we just want to make sure the structure is solid. We love this community. Their issue wasn't the fact that public housing itself was a problem. They just felt that they always were disregarded when it came to how to develop their housing, because they wanted two-story, as they had, 2 stories, front yard, backyard. It was a family, they wanted a family structured space, but they also wanted a neighborhood that wasn't completely isolated, because that was the other way that they did, was they would just put African Americans, particularly African American women, in the far southeast.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I mean, and I'm glad you raised retail, sort of commercial, like how we incorporate that in as well. You know, we don't, you know, when we talk about rent control, which not many cities have, we do have a form of rent control, but it's residential rent control. You know, and so what would it look like to have some sort of commercial rent control for, or an ability to kind of enable long-term businesses, small businesses to stay in place? You know, how do we do that? I think is a really good question. I don't know if commercial rent control, some form of that is an answer, but some way to enable businesses to stay in place as property values go up, as rents go up. And I think also, just to piggyback on what Rosemary said about, you know, this idea of, you know, public housing so often was built to be incredibly isolated, you know, from the rest of the city. And when we heard about the massive displacement of people from Southwest during urban renewal in the 50s, you know, 23,000 people were displaced from Southwest. That was a 90% low-income community, Southwest was. And so, nearly 50% of them were displaced to public housing that was being built east of the river. And so there was it was a very clear sort of resettlement of people in these spaces of containment, really. And so I think it's important to think about, you know, when we think about how we would reimagine public housing, for instance, it being in spaces that do have retail and do have all the kinds of services, the amenities, and the transportation linkages that are so necessary. And I think I really like how Jubilee Housing, which does a lot of work in Adams Morgan, and Columbia, in Ward 1 kind of, and they talk a lot about, they've been talking about what they call justice housing, which I like how they're talking about that, because when we say affordable housing, the focus is really just on, you know, can you afford the rent, which is very important, obviously, that's critical. But when they say justice housing, they're meaning something beyond just the rent levels, but also where is the housing? Is it is it in proximity to other things that people need to have a good life? And they have made a really conscious decision, which I think is interesting, to stay in Ward 1. And to do their investment in Ward 1 in terms of the housing that they're doing, the other programs, even though they know it would be like, you know, they could probably build more housing units for the same amount of money if they went to another part of the city that didn't have the same kind of infrastructure of community services and jobs that a place like that neighborhood has. And so I think, yeah, thinking about how do we keep housing, but also keep housing within this larger context of these neighborhoods and cities, and also work to make sure that all neighborhoods have those kinds of linkages and services, you know, around the city. So it's definitely it's a bigger question than just the housing. It's the retail and the services and the city itself as a place that people need.
I definitely agree with everything that you just mentioned, Amanda. And I think that the de Blasio administration is now realizing the need for commercial rent control or for protections for small businesses, right? Because even if you walk down Broadway, neighborhoods like Soho, there's so many vacancies, right? There was recently a study done on the number of vacancies block by block, and that number is astounding. I don't remember it right now, but there's a report online that you can look at. And I think what's happening is a lot of these property owners would rather leave their storefronts vacant than have someone there that could meet the needs of existing residents, but that do not have the capital that they're looking for, right? And so I think there needs to be shifts around that conversation and definitely ways to address, to protect small businesses to be able to remain in neighborhoods. Many of these places that are closing have been in the city for generations and are being violently uprooted, right? That's not a natural process. Thinking also about the right to counsel, New York City right now, recently, now all tenants who are going through the housing court process have access to legal counsel. And that is something that didn't exist before, but has dramatic impacts, right? Because 99% of landlords have access to capital to pay for attorneys, whereas many of the tenants who are facing evictions, et cetera, do not have the money or resources to pay for legal advice, right, and attorneys. So that definitely is critical. Thinking about rent freeze and rent rollback as a way to really protect sort of tenants, to protect tenants who can stay in their homes, in addition to rezoning. Thinking about rezoning as a tool, a protective tool to keep the neighborhood character, businesses, to protect tenants, to protect the existing affordable housing stock. Right now, Manhattan's Chinatown does not have protective rezoning. There's a movement to pass the Chinatown Working Group rezoning plan, which is a neighborhood rezoning plan that would protect the existing housing stock in addition to small businesses that exist in the neighborhood. One last thing is ensuring that tenants have access to interpretation in housing court, something that not many cities actually live up to.
With that, I know we probably have a lot more questions, and these conversations will continue. But I want to give space and time to the next panel as well. So if you'll all join me in thanking our panelists.